Tonight we're going to be covering the problem of miracles, and there are 6 important questions related to our apologetic task concerning miracles. Are they impossible? Are they incredible and irrational? Are they unscientific? Are they credible? Are they historical? And are they identifiable? It seems that in order to establish that a miracle happened, these are the areas that need to be covered in terms of at least answering objections to these areas, because ultimately we want to be able to affirm miracles with respect to Christianity, particularly the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if we haven't cleared up these issues and these problems related to miracles, then we will not have a clear path to establishing the claim of Christianity that God raised Jesus from the dead. Our objectives tonight: define a miracle, identify the fallacies and arguments against miracles, and 3, to describe the identifying nature of miracles. But before we jump into looking at the arguments against miracles, we want to ask the question, what can miracles accomplish? Historical Christianity is inseparable from the claims of the miraculous. However, miracles cannot demonstrate the existence of God. Given theism, we are now laying the foundation for establishing an apologetic for arguing for the correct version of theism that would be mainly between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it begs the question to use a fact as interpreted by a given worldview as an evidence for the truth of that worldview. And one way to demonstrate this fact is to hypothesize that I am able to convince an atheist and a pantheist based on historical evidence alone that Jesus of Nazareth raised from the dead. Given that situation, we must ask, if I can convince an atheist or a pantheist that Jesus rose from the dead based on historical evidence alone, does this in any way force them or cause them to accept that God, the theistic God, raised Jesus from the dead? And the answer is no, because the atheist has a category that it can put a resurrection into, namely an anomaly. An atheist might say that the resurrection of Jesus, being convinced that it did indeed happen, is simply an anomaly. It's something that is unable to be explained at present, but may in the future very well be explained by science. The pantheist likewise can put it into the category of Jesus just being added to his guru of great teachers, or even a polytheistic understanding of pantheism. In a certain religious context, may add him to the pantheon of deities that they already hold to. So there's nothing in the historical evidence itself convincing them that Jesus raised from the dead that causes them to change their worldview and conclude that God raised Jesus from the dead. So it's only the theist that has the right categories, has the right worldview in order to make the conclusion that God raised Jesus from the dead. So in order to convince the atheist and the pantheist that God raised Jesus from the dead, I first have to convert them to theism. I first have to give them an argument for the existence of the theistic God, and perhaps show why their position concerning God is contradictory or self-defeating, in order to get them to change their worldview. Then I can give them the historical evidence, and they can put into the category that God raised Jesus from the dead. Remember that in our assessment of the worldviews, only that which is unaffirmable is false, and what is undeniable is true. Only this can help us to adjudicate between worldviews as a test for truth. There are no raw facts. Facts, historical or otherwise, need to be interpreted in the context of a worldview, and the facts themselves are not going to convince someone to change their worldview. Christianity is the most systematically consistent of all the theistic worldviews, of all the theistic options between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So that's where we would argue against Judaism and Christianity. The argument for the truth of Christianity will be based on a certain degree of probability that's open to verification and falsification, because that's how evidential apologetics works with respect to historical apologetics. As Dr. Geiser says in your textbook, within a worldview or system, truth must always be decided on the basis of systematic consistency, that is, combinationalism. Whatever explains most facts' comprehensiveness, in the best fashion, the adequacy, in a non-contradictory way, that is, consistency, and in a manner that fits with the overall system, and that is coherence, will be true. And this is what we must argue for with respect to Christianity ultimately. And here, of course, miracles were paving the way in a philosophical sense to establish the possibility in miracles under the area of questions that we identified at the beginning. Now, it's also worth pointing out that most objections to miracles are an objection to the existence of God. In fact, at many points when we analyze the arguments against miracles, I'll say that this person is just begging the question in their argument. And that's a key to not only show the fallacy with respect to the argument, but it's also a sign that we should go elsewhere to make an argument with respect to naturalism or atheism and supernaturalism or theism. So when I say that this person is begging the question here, whether it's Hume or Spinoza or someone else, or begging the question of naturalism, what I'm really saying is that's where we need to go and make an argument against them. And of course, I've already given that argument against them. That's where the arguments for theism need to come into place. But that's a different arena. That takes us out of the arena of dealing with the philosophical problem of miracles and puts us into the arena of dealing with the philosophical problems concerning God's existence. So that's important to keep in mind. With respect to this issue, we're also going to be looking at a number of deistic philosophers. And it's important to kind of understand the background on which they're writing. They're writing during the deistic controversy, where in place is a Newtonian understanding of the world, sometimes called a world machine, in which the view exists that they're going to be able to mathematically explain the entire universe and how it works. And so this is the background to Hume and other people, David Hume and other people that we'll be looking at. And also, it's worthy to note, if you remember when we did our first lesson on a history of apologetics, we identified certain people such as Samuel Clarke, 1705, and William Paley in 1794, that actually argued against Hume and other positions. Spinoza, as we'll see, argued against them in terms of their critique of miracles. And believe it or not, a lot of the arguments that are made today with modern-day contemporary apologists are not much different than those that were made by Samuel Clarke and William Paley and others as well. So our apologetic refutation is necessary in this particular area. First of all, it's essential to the non-contradictory nature of Christianity. That is, if Christianity is contradictory, that is, it claims a miracle, but miracles are in some way not possible in one of the areas of the questions we're addressing tonight, then it cannot be true. As Paul even said, if Christ is not raised, your faith is in vain. The second thing is that if miracles are impossible, then the miracle of Christ is ultimately false. Christianity must establish the possibility of miracles in the areas that we specified at the beginning concerning our questions, or the miracle of Christ will fail. So what is a miracle? Well, let me give you a definition first from a theist, and then I'll give you a definition from an atheist. A miracle is a divine intervention into the natural world. It is a supernatural exception to the regular course of the world that would not have occurred otherwise. In other words, it's something that cannot be explained in natural terms. Someone must posit a supernatural cause with respect to the event that takes place. And if we look at the other side and look at the atheist position on this, their position is not much different than the theist. It's rare to find agreement between an atheist and a theist, but this is as close as you're going to find. A miracle is something which would never have happened had nature, as it were, been left to its own devices. And I think that these two definitions are very much similar. Now I understand that the atheist isn't going to posit a supernatural cause or explanation for it, but nonetheless they realize that a miracle cannot be explained by nature itself left to its own devices. And if we look at history, if we could go back to Thomas Aquinas, for example, his definition isn't much different than what's being used today. There's quite a bit of agreement through history and today on the issue of what is a miracle. Thomas Aquinas said that a miracle is an event that is beyond the power of nature to produce, an event that can only be explained by positing supernatural power or God's power. And to give a more elaborate definition from history, David Hume put this forth as a definition of a miracle. He said, "Nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happened in the common course of nature. It is no miracle that a man seemingly in good health should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death, though more unusual than any other, has yet been frequently observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country." Now, of course, the theist would disagree with the bottom of that, at least a Christian theist would, but his definition, the meaning of what he has with respect to a miracle, is not different than what a theist would put forth in terms of a definition, at least. So it seems like there's pretty good agreement throughout history and even today on what we mean by the term miracle. Now, I will, at the end of this, deal more specifically in qualifying a miracle. That will become extremely important to narrowing down the qualities or qualifications for a miracle in terms of being able to identify what truly is a supernatural cause. So let's first look at Benedict Spinoza and his argument against miracles. He says that miracles are impossible, and his argument goes this way. Miracles are violations of natural laws. Natural laws are unchangeable. It is impossible for unchangeable laws to be violated. Therefore, miracles are impossible. This is from his theological Tractatus. Our response to Spinoza is as follows. First of all, natural laws, we need to understand, do not describe universal, unchangeable patterns. Instead, we need to understand natural laws as only describing general events. And natural laws by nature are simply descriptive, not prescriptive. And I think that most scientists today would recognize that fact. Natural laws are written by human beings based on observations of nature. The law has no power to enforce anything or make sure that anything actually happens in nature. All it can do is sit back and describe what happens and the regularity of natural things that happen and develop descriptions with respect to those natural things. It has no enforcement whatsoever of what must happen all the time. So again, these need to be understood in prescriptive terms. And one of the problems with Spinoza's argument is he's understanding them in prescriptive terms rather than descriptive terms. So what is not unchangeable can have exceptions. Natural laws can certainly have exceptions because they have no enforcement value with respect to them. They can't make things happen a certain way. Again, all they can do is describe what normally happens. Miracles, we would argue, are exceptions to. They're not violations of natural law, as if the law is able to enforce itself in some way. Instead, they're simply exceptions to the general pattern of nature. Therefore, we would conclude that miracles can occur understood this way. So again, the major fallacy here is his understanding of natural law being prescriptive rather than descriptive. Now, David Hume actually gave 3 arguments, and we'll look at them in turn, although we'll look at the first one, and then we'll look at the second and third one a little bit later on, but we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the in-principle argument. These are from his inquiry concerning human understanding, and he gives 3 basic arguments. The in-principle argument deals with the unbelievability of miracles. The second one, the in practice one, deals with the untrustworthiness of miracles. And then the third one deals with miracles related to religion, the self-canceling act with respect to miracles. Now, it's important to understand that Hume, unlike Spinoza, does not argue for the impossibility of miracles. Instead, he argues for the incredibility of miracles. The fallacy of Hume's reasoning is well recognized by a number of modern philosophers today. However, in popular circles, and especially among students, it's very widespread assumption persists that his arguments really do show that miracles in fact cannot happen, or at least incredible. Even Anthony Flew acknowledges that Hume's arguments are somewhat fallacious, and as we'll see in his assessment, he tries to correct that. But nonetheless, Hume is very widespread used among those who would raise objections to Christians with respect to miracles, so it's important to examine all of his arguments. So are miracles incredible? And by this he means his first argument, the in principle argument, that they're simply unbelievable. He says this: a miracle is a violation of natural law. Natural law has the highest degree of probability. Miracles, by definition, is based on the lowest degree of probability. A wise man always bases his belief on that which is has the greatest probability. Therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. Now, I've given you what is referred to as the hard interpretation of Hume. There is a softer interpretation of Hume in which it would basically change violation to exception with respect to the first premise. If it is exception, then I don't think that there's any problem with respect to that issue. It just gives you a softer interpretation. I wouldn't object to the fact that miracles are exceptions to natural laws. It would just be with reference to his defining nature. So either way you take it, the argument is pretty much the same. It's just the first premise is defined differently with respect to natural law and miracles. So let's give a response to this. First of all, we must level the same critique that we had of Spinoza with Hume. Does he mean that natural laws are prescriptive or descriptive? If he means that they're prescriptive, that they're somehow causal with respect to nature itself happening, then we would have to object to that. They must be descriptive. There's nothing with respect to the laws themselves that make things happen in nature with respect to regular occurrences. So if they're prescriptive, if he asserts that they're prescriptive, then I would say that he's question begging here. He's begging the question. If he says they're descriptive, then I have no argument against him with respect to what natural law is. But if either Spinoza or Hume is going to put forth the notion that natural law is prescriptive, then it's just question begging the whole issue of miracles, and it's going to force me to go back and deal with the issue of God's existence with them. The second thing is, why base on the highest degree of probability? The odds against something do not make it impossible. The wise man, we would put forth, should base his belief on the available evidence for its happening. And also, I would conclude in my response that the result ultimately gives us what I would refer to as an invincible naturalism. In his argument, he's put us into a corner and not let us understand the world in terms of any other understanding other than naturalism. So let me flesh out point number 2 in a little bit greater detail to help you understand it. For example, the odds or the probability of throwing just 3 dice, for example, showing 6s, is 216 to 1. Yet, even though the odds are so much against it, it could still happen the very first time that someone throws the dice. And the odds with respect to a bridge hand are quite astronomical. A perfect bridge hand that could be given is up into the trillions. And yet, it has been documented in bridge tournaments that people have been dealt perfect bridge hands. But since the odds are so great against it, That is, in all the places that people have played bridge, there are more instances of not being dealt a perfect bridge hand, and therefore someone should believe that such is not even possible if we're going to follow the line of argumentation that Hume uses here. The problem with Hume's reasoning is he's adding evidence versus weighing evidence. And he's actually asserting, since the odds are so great, that even if it happens, the wise person shouldn't even believe it. But this all seems counterintuitive. Even if the odds are greatly against a singularity happening, Hume is saying that you should not even believe it if it happens, based on his argumentation that involves adding evidence against us rather than weighing or examining the evidence at hand. C.S. Lewis responds to Hume's argument this way. He says, now of course we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if in other words they have never happened, why then they never have. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them is to be uniformed only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. And this is what it means when I say that it results in an invincible naturalism. I can't get out of his naturalistic circle with respect to reasoning unless, of course, I go back and argue for the existence of a supernatural being such as God. Hume once argued that there is no way to know if the sun will rise tomorrow based on the past. I think it's the case that he's being very inconsistent if he's going to assert something like that and then give his argument against miracles. If that's the case, then there's no way for him to exclude the possibility of miracles based on the universally established patterns in the past. If he's going to say that we should believe that dead men stay dead because of all the times that men have died and stayed dead, he cannot use that as a reason against miracles in a possible instance of someone actually rising from the dead based on his own principle that you can't base the past occurrences of the sun rising and the sunset that it will happen tomorrow based on all the past instances. So this is a clear inconsistency in his overall system. Now let's look at Anthony Flew. He attempts to actually update Hume, agreeing somewhat that there are some problems and inconsistencies in his thinking. He attempts to put forward the notion that miracles are just irrational. His argument goes this way. Miracles are by nature particular and unrepeatable. Scientific laws by nature describe general and repeatable events. Evidence for the general and repeatable is always greater than that for the particular and unrepeatable. Evidence will always be greater against miracles than for them. Therefore, one should never believe in miracles. This is very similar to Hume's argument and is really just kind of an updating of the argument itself. And I think that the same fallacies that I've leveled at Hume are able to be leveled at this particular argument as well. But let me remind you of something. Neither Hume nor Flew present arguments against the possibility of miracles. Again, they all conclude that we just should not believe in miracles based on some argumentation that very well has naturalistic overtones with respect to it. So let me respond to his argument. And my basic response or underlying response is that he's just begging the question of naturalism. For example, when he makes the assertion of naturalistic unrepeatability, then much of science really needs to be thrown out. For example, there's a singular origin to the universe itself. There's a singular origin to life itself. And if he's going to make this assertion of naturalistic unrepeatability, that things must be repeatable in order for it to be discovered and examined by science, then he's going to have to throw these things out as well. And of course, science wants to understand the origin of life on Earth, and it wants to understand the origin of the universe, and it investigates these things. But according to these assertions in this argument, it has no jurisdiction there. It can't go there because these are things that are unrepeatable. And second is this naturalistic unfalsifiability. It says everything that happens in the world, the natural world, is caused by the natural world. Well, of course, this is just ultimately begging the question. It begs the question by assuming in advance of looking at the evidence that is always greater, will always be greater against it. But how can his naturalism ultimately ever be falsified in any way? No matter what actually occurs, we would be obligated to believe it was not a miracle. But of course, this just begs the question of naturalism. In fact, one commentator on Hume calls this a bilk. No amount of evidence of actual happening will ever convince him that a miracle has indeed occurred. Anything that's put forth, if it actually did happen, is going to be understood in natural terms. But then we can throw it back on him. If he can beg the question, being an atheist, why can't a theist do the same? Why can't a theist claim that God causes everything to happen, including natural events, and at times causes special things to occur that we would see as exceptions? Now, of course, if I made that assertion, he would say that I'm begging the question of theism. But that's the very thing that he's doing in his argument as well. So again, this all pushes us out of the realm of arguing philosophically for or against miracles and into the realm of settling the question of the existence of a supernatural being, such as God or not. Sometimes it's put forth this way. This is something that's very popularly said, especially in free-thinking groups and society and people, and you'll hear it on the college campuses quite a bit. They'll say that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. This is a slogan put forth, and it's sometimes hard to pin down exactly what they mean by this. But I think the best way to take it is that they mean that there must be an enormous amount of evidence. Now, they can't possibly mean that they want miraculous evidence, because of course that would lead to the miraculous. But I'd like to put forth that if it needs to be understood in terms of an enormous amount of evidence, the slogan is just false, as usually it's understood. An improbable event does not need to have a lot of evidence. And one of the ways to show this is what is referred to as Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem, put forth this way, says that intrinsic probability of a hypothesis, for example R, where God raised Jesus from the dead, depends on our background knowledge, that is B, and it includes facts which we can take from other arenas and other areas, such as arguments found in natural theology, which we've already given. That being the case, the probability of RB can be put forth in almost a mathematical sense. William Craig makes great use of this in his book and often uses it in his debates. Bayes' theorem, sometimes referred to as probability calculus, Craig says, shows that rationally believing in a highly improbable event doesn't require an enormous amount of evidence. What is crucial is that the evidence be far more probable given that the event did occur than given that it did not. And I think one of the values of Bayes' theorem is that it shows that oftentimes people only look at it with respect to one side of the equation. They only look at one aspect of the equation and they don't take in other aspects. In other words, they look at miracles not concerning the other side of it, which has to do with the background knowledge. They look at all the historical evidence with respect to God raising Jesus from the dead or Jesus being raised from the dead. They'll look at that and examine that, but they'll do it to the exclusion of the background knowledge. The context, the religious context in which that happens is ignored. And also, they won't go to other disciplines such as natural theology and look at the arguments for the existence of God. But Bayes' theorem says that you have to do that. You have to look at both sides, not only the historical evidence, but you have to also include in the natural theology and arguments for the existence of God. And I think once you do that, the phrase, the slogan, kind of diminishes in terms of its importance. It's not the notion of extraordinary evidence, it's just the notion of evidence given the historical evidence combined with the background knowledge in philosophy. So then we come to another area of objection. We'll return later to some more arguments of Hume, but first we want to take a look at the issue of are miracles unscientific? Many scientists particularly have argued that miracles are just unscientific. If miracles were bought into by scientists, then science as science would just not be possible. They argue in a way like this: miracles are contrary to scientific explanations. Miracles are contrary to the scientific method. And if we allow for miracles or anything to be explained in science with respect to the supernatural, then science is just not going to be able to work in the methods and in the ways that it is meant or intended to get results. So are miracles contrary to science? I don't think so. The scientific method remains intact, even with the claim that there are some rare singularities, and we can admit, for the sake of argumentation, that these rare singularities may very well have natural causes. That's not a problem. Positing a supernatural cause for the origin of some rare events in no way affects the domain of science. Science is based on regular pattern of events, not on rare ones. And the scientific method, therefore, has the right to demand explanatory control over all the regular events. But it also needs to be understood that science as such has no right to claim that it alone can provide scientific explanations for all singularities. There is a category that can be put forth with respect to science where it's not yet explained in terms of natural events. And it isn't the fact that science has to conclude supernaturalism, but it can at least put rare events into the category, or not yet explained events, into the category of unexplained natural, or yet to be explained in terms of natural causes or natural events. So we can grant science its ultimate authority in the classification of regular events, but it is not unlimited in terms of naturalistic explanations of singular events. If, for example, they come across something that they can't specify how a singular event happened, unrepeated event, and as a part of the regular pattern, then they must put it into a classification of it not yet explainable as a natural event. Now, if anybody in the scientific community says or wants to rule out the supernatural completely from a possible explanation, and I understand that it may take them into a different field to do that, such as the area of metaphysics, and that's fine. They can certainly say and assert that the notion of the supernatural cause is not in the realm of science, and that's okay if they want to do that. But to say that every event only has a naturalistic cause is to assert a naturalistic faith. It simply, again, begs the question of naturalism. And of course, that throws us back to settling that issue in some other arena with respect to philosophy. Now let's return to Hume's arguments here. His second argument, David Hume says that miracles are untrustworthy. This is the argument based on in practice. And he reasons this way: no miracle can be established without sufficient evidence. Sufficient evidence must include a sufficient number of witnesses educated with unquestionable integrity. No such sufficient evidence has occurred. Therefore, no miracle has ever been established. So let's return to Hume's second argument that deals with the untrustworthy aspect of miracles. This is the in practice argument. Hume reasons this way. He says no miracle can be established without sufficient evidence. Sufficient evidence must include a sufficient number of witnesses educated with unquestionable integrity. No such sufficient evidence has occurred. Therefore, no miracle has ever been established. Now notice that this argument is de facto, it's not de jure. It doesn't make a judgment with respect to miracles itself. In fact, it actually opens the question with regards to miracles and establishes the possibility of something having factual confirmation or disconfirmation. So this, in effect, really gives an advantage to Christianity, because all I have to show is that there is sufficient evidence. With respect to the criterion, we may disagree about the number of witnesses or the education of the witnesses, and we can settle those things with regards to historical comparisons and so forth. But nonetheless, it leaves, premise number 2 leaves the issue or the question open. Now, with the issue of number 3, that there's no sufficient evidence has occurred, we do need to question, what does he mean by sufficient? Because we need to be careful here. Is something so narrowly defined in terms of being sufficient that we can't establish anything on historical grounds? So we need to come up with a sensible definition of sufficient, and this, of course, we can leave to history to do. But nonetheless, this argument, again, is de facto, it's not de jure. It's not making an argument against miracles in any way. It's trying to set up a criterion by which miracles can be judged in terms of history. And again, I think Christianity can turn this around and use it. Hume's third argument, or his last argument, is a self-canceling argument. It argues with respect to miracles as used in various religious systems. It reasons this way: contrary truth claims are mutually self-canceling. All religions claim miracles in support of their truth claims. Therefore, no miracles can support a religion with respect to truth claims. Let's respond to this. First of all, the assumption of this entire argument with respect to miracles and religion is the assumption that the evidence in all the religions is actually the same. And we can agree with Hume that contraries are mutually self-canceling when they are supported by the same kind of evidence. But ultimately, I think that this type of argumentation can be turned around and lead to a strong support for Christianity. It too leaves open the door of possible verification. We can reason this way: all theistic truth claims supported by similar or like evidence for miracles are mutually self-canceling. There we'll agree with Hume. But if we can show that Christianity is supported by unique miraculous evidence, evidence that is not found in other religions, hence it's unique, then I think it follows, therefore, that Christianity alone can lay rightful claim to miraculous truth. Another way in which we could reason about this is point out to the fact that he assumes that all the evidence in the religions is the same. The testimony concerning miracles can be established on historical grounds, and the verification of Christian miracles serves as a canceling test of other religions that claims miracles. God, because of his nature, that we would find out from our argument for theism, would not verify two religions opposed in their essential teaching. Therefore, only one religion can have unique miraculous confirmation from God. To give you an example, if Christianity affirms that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, and Islam comes and says, no, Christianity did not, or Christ did not die on the cross or raise from the dead, then it would not be the case that God, given his nature that we know from theism, would verify both of these religions, which are contradictory in their truth claims, via miracles. Only one of them would be verified via miracles, if that's true, from God. So now let's deal with the issue of, are they historical? And there's two areas I'd like to address with respect to this issue. The first one is Ernst Troeltsch's principle of analogy. It says that the past does not differ essentially from the present. So he reasons, and others follow him, many in history follow this principle, therefore reasons that the miracles in the gospel makes it incompatible with the present, because obviously we don't experience the same miracles that the apostles did in the context of the gospels. Since we don't experience those today, automatically we must put the gospels into a category of not being historical. And the second one comes from a modern New Testament critic, a contemporary New Testament critic, Bart Ehrman. He says that since historians can establish only what probably happened in the past, they cannot show that miracles happened, since this would involve a contradiction, that the most improbable event is the most probable. Now, I think in both of these instances, something is happening, that these principles that are being put forth are constricting principles, and the sense that they're making all past events to be purely natural events and forcing us to that position. But of course, again, this is just begging the question of naturalism. In response to Troeltsch's analogy, I think, first of all, he presupposes naturalism or a non-theistic worldview. Of course, this is just begging the question and forces us, as always, to go back to the issue of theism and deal with that versus atheism and deal with that. But the second thing is that there's not a lack of analogy that's at work here, but it's the positive analogy to what is known to be untrue. And this has most recently been worked on by Wolfhart Pannenberg, in which he corrects Troeltsch's analogy or principle by asking the question, why is something being dismissed, something as myth? Why is something dismissed as myth or legend being unhistorical? In other words, it could be put this way: we would reject the gospel narratives of the resurrection if it completely corresponded to the model of hallucinations that are known to exist today, or if it completely was based on unreliable testimony. If that condition existed, then we would reject the Gospels because it doesn't correspond, or because it meets the category of what is rejected today, namely our understanding of hallucinations or unreliable testimony. It should not be rejected just because there is no quote-unquote kind of present-day analogous event. To quote Craig in this regard, when an event is said to have occurred for which no present analogy exists, we cannot automatically dismiss its historicity. To do that, we must have an analogy to some known form of consciousness to which no reality corresponds that would suffice to explain the situation. Myths are dismissed not because they're unusual, but because there are no known forms of consciousness exist today to explain the situation, historical reality. In response to Bart Ehrman, I think he has two problems. First, he refuses to combine the probabilities of the resurrection on our total evidence with our background knowledge. Of course, this takes us back to Bayes' theorem, in which he's only looking at one side of the equation. He's only looking at the historical evidence, for example, and not looking at our background evidence, which has to do with the arguments for establishing theism. And second, given historians are, quote, unable to establish what God does, as he says, it is logically contradictory with asserting that the resurrection is intrinsically improbable. As Dr. Craig says, if the historian cannot say anything about God, neither can he say anything that it is improbable that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, the historian would have to say that the probability of Jesus' resurrection is just something that is not able to be investigated at all with respect to historical terms. Now we want to turn to a more precise understanding with respect to identifying that which is miraculous. And I'll start off by actually giving an argument, a positive argument, that miracles do in fact flow from theism. And we can argue this way: an omnipotent God can do anything that is possible. Miracles are possible. They're not impossible. Again, they're not to be understood as violations of nature, but they're to be understood as exceptions to nature. Therefore, miracles can occur or are in fact possible. This is in fact what C.S. Lewis says when he says, if you admit God, yes, miracles are possible. Now, to defend this, the only limits for omnipotence are logically the only limits for omnipotence are related to that which is a logical impossibility, such as square circles, or that which is actually impossible, such as God causing himself to cease to exist, which would be an actual impossibility. Miracles are not anti-natural or against nature. It is a supernatural, so it is not contrary to nature. Another way to think of this in a theistic understanding is that the universe, everything is dependent on God for its continued cause, which we would see from our vertical cosmological argument. So God operates naturally in a general sense and can operate on special occasions to make exceptions to those natural laws. This may be rare versus the regular, but nonetheless, God holds everything in existence in a continual basis, and then in a general sense, in a regular sense, and then is able to operate in a special sense on rare occasions to do that which is an exception to the natural law. One of these is not harder than the other for God. God holding everything in existence is not harder than God for God in terms of doing a rare miracle. And we would grant that some miracles may be impossible. God willing a miracle against a previous willed miracle would be impossible. That would be a logical contradiction. And of course, God also, it would be impossible against his nature for him to confirm two contrary systems or two contrary religions, as the example I gave earlier between Islam and Christianity. He couldn't possibly do that because it would be against his nature to affirm things which are contradictory via miracles. In further identifying miracles, I think it's important to divide them into what some have called first-class miracles and second-class miracles. For example, in second-class miracles, it may be the case, and I emphasize the notion of may be the case, that some of the miracle or some aspects of the miracle may actually be able to be described scientifically speaking. May even be possible for science someday to reduplicate or give a purely natural explanation for it. But what makes the event put in the category of being supernatural for us, or the second-class miracle, is when it happens, in the context it happens, in a religious setting particularly. For example, there are some aspects to the Israelites crossing the Red Sea that involve natural occurrences, such as a strong wind comes to divide the waters. Science may be able to explain that aspect of it, but it can't explain the religious socio context of it happening then when the Israelites need to cross the Red Sea to escape the pursuing Egyptians. That can't be explained by science. There are also aspects of the miracle that defy explanation and may put aspects of it into a first-class miracle. A first-class miracle, for example, them crossing on dry ground, may not be able to be explained because it takes a supernatural cause for that to happen. This would put some aspects of it in a first-class miracle. This is a miracle that the exception to the natural process must be a supernatural cause, given the case in the context of theism. So some would ask, how can this be claimed unless one knows for sure the processes are undiscoverable or discoverable? Someone could make the assertion, well, if we can explain second-class miracles scientifically, why can't it be the case that first-class miracles ultimately would be brought into the category of a second-class miracle, or reducible to the category of a second-class miracle? To answer this question, the only thing we can say is to put forth the notion under a first-class miracle is that it cannot be produced by natural processes, or to answer it in terms of what nature does not produce. In other words, if it's something that cannot be produced by natural processes, or something that nature does not produce, then we can put it in the classification of a first-class miracle. The resurrection of Jesus, for example, would fit this particular classification, while aspects of, say, the crossing of the Red Sea with the Israelites, at least aspects of it, may involve a second-class miracle. Now, I think it's important in identifying miracles to distinguish a miracle from things that it might actually be confused with. So let's first give a definition of a miracle and use and understand it in terms of our second-class and first-class qualifications. A miracle is a non-natural or scientifically unusual exception to the normal pattern because they're either one, rare in the terms of a second-class miracle and cannot be repeated, or two, never with respect to first-class miracles will be repeated and requires outside manipulation. This being the case, I think this is a good qualification with respect to our definition of miracles. Second, we also have to put them into the context. Miracles entail theological truth. It may provide for a sign or a message or to verify something that is from God. In other words, miracles just don't happen everywhere. They have to have a theological context. It's what God would use to give a sign of something that He wants to communicate to us. We would also at this point could add that it's not a satanic sign. That is, we could contrast it with regards to that which is evil. A miracle that is truly from God would always be associated with the truth about God in a theological sense. It would always be associated with the moral good, not moral evil, and it would always be associated with the work of God, not the work of man or the work of evil, with respect to its purposes. So also we need to add to this that it would always fit the moral purposes of God. That is, it would correspond to the good nature of God, the good nature of God that we know from our argumentation for theism. We would also have to identify a miracle to help distinguish it as something that would fit nature. In other words, a miracle is not anti-natural or against nature. It's an exception, but it's not a contradiction. It's a suspension of nature, but it's not a violation of nature. We could also further make distinguishing marks with respect to a miracle that it's not magic. Magic is a trick. So it should not be mistaken for what a magician is able to do, whether with respect to a magic trick being done for good or for evil for that matter. It's not simply the hand being quicker than the eye. It truly is the category of being supernatural. And it's not an anomaly. It's not something that is to be put in the category of unable to be explained. Given these distinguishing characteristics, we can explain it and at least distinguish it as a miracle. In order to demonstrate the importance of these distinguishing characteristics, I'd like to take one of David Hume's examples one last time and show why these distinguishing characteristics we've identified with respect to miracles are so important. David Hume gives an example of Queen Elizabeth dying and then coming back to life, revivifying or revivification of her, and explains why he would not believe this to be the case. He says, January 1st, 1603, Queen Elizabeth publicly died and was buried, and her successor installed later that month. But Queen Elizabeth reappeared, resumed the throne, and ruled England for 3 more years. Hume says that he would rather believe the hypothesis of a faked death and burial, even in the face of a full proof of her miraculous revivification. But I'd like to point out that there's no religious context to Queen Elizabeth, and that this miracle would make no sense with respect to God being the cause of it, given a full proof for this miraculous. What is important is the religious context, and given no religious context for Queen Elizabeth, we would not put this into a classification either with respect to a full proof of the miraculous. What we need and what we mean as a distinguishing miracle is a religious context. And when we take the context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and teaching that changed his followers against their own educational and cultural understanding of a deity to accept him as Lord and Savior, and to proclaim his salvation in his name alone, this can't ignore the momentous time of its occurrence religiously in the context of Jesus' own life. And that it is not just a resuscitation, it's not just a revivification of a mortal body, but it's a miraculous transformation of his body that takes place, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. His body is transformed and given a new immortal existence, a new mode of existence that nature cannot account for. And in nature, this has never occurred again. So as we can see, the religious context is extremely important, and also the rarity of miracles. If such resurrections as Jesus happened all the time, it would lose its apologetic value. So it's very important to apologetics that the resurrection be looked at as a singular event and that it be understood in its religious context. So given all that we have said about miracles, let's go back to our outline of apologetics. Miracles are possible and can confirm a message from God. And here, hopefully, we've demonstrated that the problem of miracles does not eliminate their possibility, their detectability, or the confirmatory nature involving a message from God. And given this, we're on good grounds to move to the problem of history in order to clear up any difficulties there.